Hello and welcome back to Solomon's Cave and a new series on the Bible. In this series, I will be looking with an extreme attention to detail to the first two verses of the book of Genesis. That's right, the first two verses of Genesis will not just get one video, but a whole series of videos, because there is a lot to unpack here. Just a warning up front. A lot of this will deal with technical details of biblical Hebrew. I will describe those details in such a way that you won't have to learn the language first, but I will also link, wherever possible, to videos from the Biblical Hebrew playlist if you want to learn more. So, let's get started. The first word of the Hebrew Bible is Bereshit, as I've mentioned in some of my previous videos. It also serves, in the tradition of the ancient Near East, as the title of the book. This first word consists of two elements, the preposition be and the noun reshit. Let's begin with be. In English, we have a large variety of prepositions. For example, in, at, under, by, with, during, next to, towards, from, after, before, etc. Biblical Hebrew, however, has significantly fewer prepositions. Or, well, technically they do have a lot of them, but in practice most are rarely used, and a handful are used all the time. This means that these commonly used prepositions can fulfill a large variety of roles. We do this in English. Take the word to, for example. You can use this to indicate motion in space, I am going to the market, or it can identify the beneficiary or recipient of something, I gave flowers to my wife. It can say something about the limits of a range. It can take up to 7 weeks for your package to arrive. And in math, you can raise numbers to a certain power. The point is that we use the preposition to in a wide variety of ways, and we have no difficulty distinguishing the precise meaning of it. Now, back to be in Hebrew. A good place to start is to think of the English preposition in, either in a spatial sense, like inside or into, or in a more abstract sense, like among or with or by. Think of in the presence of or in the company of, or in a temporal sense, like during or when or at a certain time. The specific nuance will have to come from the word it is connected with and the broader context. And this brings us to the noun reshit, which means beginning. At this point, I'm going to have to explain something about the forms of Hebrew nouns, because there are two different forms a noun can take, the status absolute and the status construct. This is a complex topic, and on my Hebrew playlist I plan to make a video about it at some point in the future. For now, all you need to know is the following. If the word reshit is in the absolute state, you should understand it as the beginning. If it is in the construct state, you should understand it as the beginning of X, the beginning of something. And the second thing you should know at this point is that you can often see if a noun is in the status absolute or the status construct. But it also happens quite often that the two forms look identical. So let's look at the context here. If we are to assume that it is the status construct, that means we have to find a word that fits in the slot of X. The kinds of words that could conceivably fit here include other nouns, adjectives, infinite verbs, participles, and a few other words. Genesis 1:1 doesn't have any adjectives, infinitives, or participles, so those can easily be discarded. What is left are 3 nouns and a finite verb. The first noun is Elohim, or God. This would lead to a translation like in the beginning of God, which sounds great, but there are some grammatical reasons why that wouldn't work. The other nouns, eretz and shamayim, also don't work, because they are clearly marked as objects of the verb to create. See a future video in this series. The only thing that is left is the finite verb to create. Now, construct nouns do not, usually, connect with finite verbs, though it can happen in some instances. Most interesting here is Hosea 1 verse 2, where you have a construct noun, techilat, meaning beginning, referring to a point in time, followed by a finite verb, diber, meaning he spoke, and a subject, yod-he vav-he, which is the divine name, which roughly translates to when the Lord first spoke. The advantage here is that tekalath does have a different form when it is construct, so here there is no ambiguity. Applying that idea here would create a translation like when God began to create. Bereshit appears some 50 times in the Hebrew Bible, and each time it is in the status construct, with the only exception being Isaiah 46 verses 9 and 10. Now let's take a step back and see what happens with the rest of the verse and the beginning of this chapter when we opt for one understanding or another. If we take the more traditional understanding of this word, namely as though it were in the absolute state, we see that verse 1 becomes a complete sentence. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. It is simple, straightforward, and also stylistically in line with the rest of the chapter. It also means that the first 7 words of this chapter, a chapter where the number 7 will appear a lot, would form one sentence and describe a complete thought. If we read this as a construct state, we read something like this: in the beginning, when God created the heaven and the earth, or perhaps when God began creating the heaven and the earth. In which case, the first complete sentence doesn't end there, but continues on into the second and perhaps even the third verse. And you may get something like this: when God began creating the heavens and the earth was empty and void. Or, when God began creating the heaven and the earth being empty and void, etc., God said. In this interpretation, the first 2 verses clearly state that God's creating or baraing started when the world was still empty and void, or tohu and bohu. More on that later. Before I wrap up this video, there are 2 more little details to mention here. The first is the presence or absence of the definite article in the beginning. If you have a basic familiarity with biblical Hebrew, you know that the definite article ha would normally manifest itself when combined with the preposition like be as a kametz underneath the beith. So, Bereshit instead of Bereshit. However, the presence or absence of the definite article is surprisingly hardly discussed by scholars. It is interesting to note its absence, but it does not influence the broader understanding of this word or this verse in any way. For if there were a definite article, then sure, it is the absolute state and the traditional understanding would be clear. But now that it is absent, both interpretations are possible. And if the absolute interpretation is chosen, English requires the definite article even if Hebrew doesn't. One last quick comment before I end this video about something that will become relevant when we look at verse 2, namely, the word beginning in English is a little ambiguous, as it can refer both to a moment or a point in time or a period of time. In Hebrew, Bereshit is a bit clearer in this regard, as it refers to a period of time. It is therefore possible that verse 1 is the title, summarizing the whole of chapter 1, with the actual text beginning in verse 2. However, the pros and cons of that interpretation will be discussed in more detail in a future video. In summary, there are 2 ways of understanding the first word and how it relates to the rest of the sentence. It is either in the beginning or in the beginning of. The former being the traditional understanding in which Genesis 1 verse 1 is an independent clause or a complete sentence. The second one will turn Genesis 1 verse 1 into a dependent clause describing a time period in which what follows takes place. Though most English translations, as well as most translations in other languages that I've seen, translate the traditional view, a few translations, like the NRSV or New Revised Standard Version, translate the alternative view, and a few others have the alternative translation in a footnote. As for my opinion, you may ask, well, I do have an opinion, but I'd like you to take a moment to think about it as well. Besides, some of the arguments used for one or the other are tied up in our understanding of some of the other words in these first two verses. So, before I give you my opinion, I want to explore the rest of Genesis 1 verse 1 and 2 with you. Regardless of which interpretation is correct, you can now hopefully see the grammatical and syntactical challenges hidden in the first word of the Bible. And with all of these complexities in mind, I will end this video and I will see you in the next one, where we will explore the meaning of the next word in the Bible, bara.